Look, I know there's a lot of stuff to talk about and many lore revelations to be had from all this stuff in the Bedtime story Archon quest, but there's something I'm a little fixated on. Something that's so incredibly obvious to me in hindsight that I feel a little bit silly for not realizing it until this quest. You see, Caribert doesn't have the only Loom of Fate. In fact, by my count, we've already seen at least 7 additional Looms of Fate. And there are probably still more to come. HoYoverse has literally been yeeting the same idea at us over and over and over again, and it's only now that it's all coming together. So, in today's video, we're gonna dive into what makes a Loom of Fate tick, why I think there are a bunch of them, and maybe, just maybe, we'll have a revelation or two along the way. You know, as a treat. As always, timestamps, spoiler warnings, citations, attributions, and links for further content will be in the description box, while post-video notes and corrections can always be found in the pinned comment. Now then, let's start things off by establishing what a Loom of Fate is. Actually, we need to learn about the ley lines first, because as Caribert tells us, the true purpose of the Loom of Fate is to weave new ley lines. And we can't exactly talk about how to weave something without knowing what we're weaving now, can we? To put it simply, ley lines are like the blood vessels of the planet that circulate elemental energy and memories in the same way the heart pumps blood throughout the body. This planetary vascular system is incredibly important because the elemental energy it carries literally makes up the physical world. Now, the game hints at this a lot, but rather than point you to a dozen or more examples, just take note of how this loading screen about the elements calls them the building blocks of the world. So considering that the elements are the building blocks of the physical world, I bet you can easily see how tampering with the ley lines that carry them around can cause all kinds of abnormalities. These are called ley line disorders, and you're probably very familiar with them because they're inside of every combat domain. But in Teyvat proper, the best example of a large-scale ley line disorder is Dragonspine. This icy mountain was originally a lush green paradise, but a celestial nail disrupted the flow of the local ley lines, which froze the entire mountain. But the effects brought about by the ley line disorders aren't something that are unique to just the ley lines. Technically speaking, any kind of massive release of elemental energy into an area can create big problems in the physical realm. Dragons, for example, are elemental beings of incredible purity, so their deaths can be likened to large-scale ley line disorders. That's why, in Nahida's second story quest, Nahida warns that if Apep dies and all her elemental energy is released, the forest will grow exponentially due to the sudden influx of dendro energy. For this reason alone, we can connect elemental beings like the dragons to the ley lines as far as their impact or power over the physical world goes. And the game also wants us to link them together. See, ley lines are based on the Chinese concept of Dimai, or earth veins, which carry qi or vital energy throughout the planet. But Dimai is also connected to the concept of Longmai, or dragon veins. Fitting for the whole Dragon King thing, isn't it? But here's the thing. Elemental energy and memories are actually interchangeable. You can think of it like water and ice. They're the same molecule, but in 2 different states. So when stuff like the parametric transformer says elemental energy and memories flow within the ley lines, it's just talking about the same thing in 2 different variations. This is why Apep was able to reabsorb her elemental fragments during Nahida's second story quest and obtain all of her memories in the process. What, is that not convincing enough for you? Well then, take a look at the game's stamina system, Resin. It's canonically condensed elemental energy, and we use it to cleanse blockages in the ley lines or to revitalize petrified trees. In return, the ley line blossoms and trees give us crystallized memories in the form of artifacts and ascension materials. So basically, these plants are transmuting elemental energy from one form to another. And if transmutation makes you think of alchemy, then congratulations, because you're onto something. The Dust of Azoth tells us that alchemy is actually the, quote, study of the nature of matter and the rules that underpin its transformations, and ultimately it seeks to comprehend the working principles of the world and the flow of the ley lines. And the description for the crafting bench tells us that the elements can be used to weave our journey, which is an interesting choice of words to use in the context of weaving new ley lines with the Loom of Fate, don't you think? Now, you might be wondering why all this matters. After all, we're mostly just learning about the ley lines in order to understand how the Loom of Fate works, right? Well, yeah, that's exactly the point. See, while a completed Loom of Fate weaves new ley lines that carry elemental energy and memories around, an incomplete Loom of Fate can only be used to create and implant memories. A completed loom loses this ability in favor of being able to change the world. But if you stop and think about it for a minute, it's not exactly that the loom loses an ability when it reaches completion. It's that it starts altering things on a different scale, a larger scale. An incomplete loom can alter the memory of a few people at a time, but a complete loom can manipulate the memory of the whole world. And you know what holds the memory of the physical world in Teyvat? Irminsul, the world tree. And it just so happens that Irminsul's roots are the ley lines. Irminsul weaves ley lines just by putting out its own roots. It's just doing what a tree normally does. And this ability alone is also enough to qualify it, in my eyes at least, as a Loom of Fate. And actually, just by being a tree, Irminsul perfectly illustrates why a Loom of Fate can only weave new ley lines and not alter existing ones in any way. See, if ley lines are the roots of a tree and the Loom of Fate is a tree, then it would make sense that a tree can only really grow its own roots and not extend or modify the roots of other trees, right? And by that logic, the goal of any Loom of Fate operation is to create a brand new Irminsul, to plant a new world tree. But with a name like Loom of Fate, we have to assume its job is to alter fate somehow, right? Well, if a complete Loom of Fate can only weave ley lines, then ley lines must be part of the system of fate. Now, I realize that last part might have been a bit obvious and I didn't really need to say it, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, because if the ley lines are the roots of Irminsul and weaving ley lines is what a Loom of Fate does, then not only is Irminsul a Loom of Fate, but it's also fate itself. The reason I'm so hung up on this idea is that up to this point, the game has been telling us over and over and over again that it's the stars that dictate our fate. Constellations display your destiny. Everything is written in the stars, dictated by heaven. We can confirm this too thanks to Nouvelette's character stories, where he says that fate is the system by which Celestia controls the mortal world, and this system is related to constellations, which is made up of stars. This is a concept you can learn way more about in this video I made about how Celestia stole Teyvat with its fate system. It might be a little bit outdated now, but it's aged very, very well in light of Bedtime story. But until you watch it, because you will watch it, the power of theories compels you, the biggest takeaway is that heaven and earth are reflections of each other. The heavens move in the form of the stars, and the ley lines of the earth adjust themselves to match. To quote Zhongli's Chinese burst line, the heavens move and everything else follows. Layla, an astrologer, even suggests this to us during the Parade of Providence event when she talks about how the stars appear to be reflections of the ley lines. And here's where things get interesting and a little bit tinfoil hat-ish. About 3 years ago, Reddit user Objective Emotional decided to try overlaying every Liyue character's constellation on top of the map of Liyue using teleport waypoints as stars. And it worked. And the best part is that a lot of the constellations overlapped on top of areas that had particular meaning to the character in question, like how Xiao's constellation overlapped with Wangshu Inn. Sure, there were a couple that were a bit off, like Chi-Chi's, but I bet that wouldn't be the case now that we have Chenyu Vale. This could be a complete coincidence, or another example of Hoyoverse's ridiculous attention to detail. I have no idea which it is, but if it is intentional, then it might blow my mind, because there's some stuff in the game that suggests this could actually be the case. See, the teleport waypoints and the Statues of Seven are all plugged directly into the ley lines. It's how they teleport us around the map, and their description says that they are seemingly forming a certain order. Like, I don't know, maybe the order of the stars? And this is made even more mind-boggling because the teleport waypoints are constructed in such a way as to match the little memory nodes inside of Irminsul. They're the little nodes meant to create points of connection between the ley lines and the stars, anchor points for Irminsul in the physical realm. So what about the Statues of Seven? Yeah, what about those Statues of Seven? So you guys might not know this, but all of my friends are much smarter than me. And one of my friends, Saber, made this thing a couple of years back because she thought it was super weird that the Statues of Seven looked like real-world Ermin columns. The thing about Ermin columns is that they were frequently topped with the figure of a deity. Real-world reasoning aside, I think these Statues of Seven differ from the teleport waypoints in that they represent an Archon's role in controlling or regulating Irminsul. It's almost like they're operating on a higher level of authority, which might be why unlocking a Statue of Seven reveals portions of the map, the physical world, while unlocking teleport waypoints doesn't. I could go on and on and on, but what it all boils down to is that Celestia is basically in control of the mega Loom of Fate that is Irminsul. And if anyone wants to buck the system and change their fate, they're gonna have to make a loom that can rival Irminsul. And that's a really tall order. Not that it's stopped people from trying. Just to recap, an incomplete Loom of Fate is capable of creating and implanting memories at first, and those abilities get stronger over time. If I had to guess what that'd look like, I'd say that the memory creation is the first ability it gets, then memory alteration, then memory deletion, before finally combining the three into the ability to weave the ley lines themselves. And I think this because Nahida exists. Nahida is the avatar of Irminsul, a completed Loom of Fate, and as its avatar, she possesses the ability to read minds, travel through the ley lines, and enter and manipulate people's dreams. Her predecessor also created the Akasha system, which linked the minds of the people of Sumeru together to form one collective consciousness that she used to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. Which, frankly, sounds a bit like challenging fate, especially since one of its functions is predicting the future based on previously collected data. It's predicting fate and trying to find alternate outcomes at the same time. We learned about this feature in the Chapter 3 Archon quest when the Academia used it to track Cyno's movements. But the Academia also used it in another, more suspicious way. They picked a person, in this case Nilou, who became the host of a collective dream. The dream repeated itself over and over and over again, and every cycle, everyone in the dream forgot what happened in the previous cycle, so it was like it never happened. And this included the Traveler, who would have been subject to the same issue had Nahida not been restoring their memories every single loop. Now, if you really think about it, this is just an example of an incomplete Loom of Fate. Just like Caribert, Nilou was the host, or the tether that the loom was built around, and all the people within the dream are providing the jnana, or dream energy used to power it. Since dreams are likened to memories and memories can be converted into elemental energy, we can think of this as memories powering the dream. It's not exactly clear to us that Caribert's loom worked exactly the same way with memories powering the whole Loom of Fate, but set your skepticism aside for a few minutes because this is only the first of 5 incomplete looms that we're going to talk about. If you unlocked Remuria, you're probably gonna remember Phobos. The story goes that the god king Remus tried to find a way to defy Fontaine's fate of melting back into the primordial sea. This is the same prophecy that we had to deal with in the Chapter 4 Archon quest. But Remus wasn't able to actually do this. Fate couldn't be broken. So he figured that if he couldn't change fate, he could just make a new fate. If he put all of his people into this new fate machine, then they'd be subject to the new fate and not the old fate that was carved into Irminsul. That's what Phobos was supposed to do. Using an eroded Seelie named Sibylla as the tether, like Caribert or Nilou, he separated the minds and bodies of his people and placed them into Phobos. And in its incomplete form, Phobos was able to manipulate the minds of others and alter memories. The same thing happens thousands of years later with René de Petrichor. He also wanted to avoid the same fate that Remus tried to change by using himself as the tether to create a collective consciousness of everyone in Fontaine, thus binding them to a completely different fate. Although the memory manipulation stuff was mostly limited to Narzissenkreuz being able to absorb people and obtain their special skills and abilities and knowledge, what's actually interesting about this loom in particular is that the Narzissenkreuz questline is full of mentions of golden butterflies, and we follow a trail of golden butterflies throughout the Bedtime story quest to find Caribert. These golden butterflies are also all over the place inside of Caribert's realm of consciousness. I talk more about butterflies and their significance in this video on Istaroth, but I think the direct parallel is interesting enough to merit a mention, because that's a very specific use of symbolism. And that brings us to the desert and Deshret's golden slumber. In that case, 1,000,000 minds merged into one and he separated mind from body, presumably using himself as a tether as well. There's no known memory manipulation here, but that's probably because everyone was distracted by all of the forbidden knowledge shenanigans. Although it's equally possible that the goddess of flowers actually became the tether. Honestly, that would make a bit more sense. But that's beside the point. You might have noticed, though, that I shifted a bit from talking about memory manipulation to hive minds or collective consciousnesses. And that's partly because it's very Jungian and Hoyo loves Jungian psychology, especially in Genshin, and partly because of the Valerian Mirage. The Valerian Mirage was the 3.8 limited event foreshadowing the events of Chapter 4, as all pre-region patch events do. It took place in a contained bottle world with an Oceanid controlling the entire thing. And what is an Oceanid but a collective consciousness? In fact, Idia's whole thing was about creating clones of the people who visited her and giving those clones a chance to live out their dreams inside the bottle. If they weren't fated to achieve their dreams in the real world, then they would be fated to achieve them in the bottle. At the heart of this bottled world was a giant tree, very Irminsul-like, and that permeates the entire landscape, and it's topped with a large wheel with a core in the middle. The wheel isn't spinning when we first arrive, and most of the bottle's functions are broken because of it. So to fix it, we have to collect several objects that represent the most important memories of the hydroclone people in the bottle. Then those components are used to reconstruct the blueprint of the wheel, which physically fixes it. Then all we need is to activate the wheel with the Shinro casket, and the wheel begins to spin again, putting out threads of energy which fixes everything that had previously broken. And by the way, the wheel is a spinning wheel, like the one that spins threads that are woven on a loom. But even with the wheel fixed, it needed the Shinro casket in order to activate. And this is interesting because the Shinro casket was made from the remains of a dragon-type yokai that responds to people's wishes. I go into way more detail about it in this video, but did you also know that Archons get their power from their people's faith? Well, faith is kind of like wishes, if you think about it. So if you pray to a statue of 7, you are entrusting them with your wishes, meaning the little orbs that the statue are holding are a lot like the pearls pearl of the Shinro casket, little power nodules for the ley lines. People offer their wishes and dreams up as faith to the statues of 7 who send that power to Celestia, and Celestia may or may not use it to control the entire world. Anyway, all of this is just to say that memories are what I think power the Loom of Fate, and I think the Central Hub's core wheel is there to illustrate all of the pieces needed to complete a loom. You will need a tether, in this case Caribert, a power source, memories, and a lot of them, and a core, which I think is what the Eye of the First Field Tiller is. It's the equivalent of the pearl that the statues of 7 hold, or the pearl of the Shinro casket. Roosevelt actually reminded me of this, but in one of the many Aranyaka quests, we meet a guy named Jazari who was studying Conrian technology, and he says that ruin machines possess a core that uses a dark power called an eye. Then if we go back to the We Will Be Reunited questline, Dainsleif said that the Abyss Order intends to build a mechanical god out of one of Venti's missing statues and the limbs of Osile. Then they're going to use the Eye of the First Field Tiller to replace the orb that Venti is holding. Do you remember how I called the orb a little power nodule? Yeah, well, think about what we collect for the statues of 7. They're oculi, also known as God's missing pupils in Chinese. And think about what visions actually are. They're external foci, fragments of an Archon's mastery, also called eyes of God in Chinese. And delusions? Also external magical foci, and also evil eyes. And according to Venti, visions are primitive versions of gnosis, and gnosis are the heart of God, but they're also the remains of the third descender, much like how the Shinro casket is made from the remains of a deceased dragon yokai. Now take a look at the first field tiller's eye. Notice how similar it is to the perpetual mechanical array's heart? To me, it feels a bit like the relationship between the vision eye and the gnosis heart. But whether it's the Eye of the First Field Tiller, the perpetual heart, visions, delusions, gnoses, they all function in similar ways and grant their hosts permission to wield power beyond the capabilities of a normal person or machine. This kind of makes them seem like symbols of authority, allowing some people or machines more control over the world than others. And if you think of them as symbols of authority, then as my buddy Crystal Marie put it, the Eye of the First Field Tiller might represent the authority of humankind. It's a synthetic eye, one with no ties to any god. It's the orb for Caribert's metaphorical statue of 7, or statue of 1, I guess, since he's alone. They needed this eye in particular because, as Dainsleif said, the first field tiller was a prototype and therefore its capabilities had no restrictions. In other words, it has more authority than any other field tiller. And this has to be tied to memory somehow, because if this eye is like the other eyes, well, that's just a shared trait of them all. Like, using a delusion erodes the user's memories, and forcibly taking away a vision from its owner also alters memories. So it stands to reason that there is some level of memories being stored inside of these little devices. But okay, sure, this is all great information and all that, but what does it mean? What is Caribert's Loom of Fate even supposed to do? Well, I think it's going to be used to revive the homeland. In other words, Conria. The Abyss Twin has already claimed that this is one of the goals of the Abyss Order, and I think this could be why the Abyss Twin and Dainsleif had a falling out in the first place. Dainsleif knows, or at least believes, that this idea of reviving the homeland by creating a new world tree just for Conria is either too dangerous, too costly, or just outright doomed to fail. And that's why he tells Halfdan that there's no need to revive the homeland. But what Dainsleif doesn't know is that this has been done before. We've actually seen a completed Loom of Fate come into being on screen, and it revitalized an entire nation and freed it from the heavenly principles. And I'm talking about the sacred Sakura. Think about it. A experienced a weird gap or alteration in her memory after Makoto died, or perhaps she was the one unaltered while the entirety of Inazuma was altered. However you slice it, there were memory shenanigans early on, just as would be the case with an incomplete Loom of Fate. Then later in her realm of consciousness, Makoto turned into a seed. And if a completed Loom of Fate becomes a tree, then an incomplete loom is basically just a seed, right? So Makoto, a god, someone capable of changing the world according to Nicole, became the scaffolding or the tether for a loom. And A granted it life, probably by feeding it her own hopes and wishes, which is just like what happens with the Shinro casket. And that should have allowed Makoto's memories to weave new ley lines that would be, and I quote, free of the heavenly principles. And why would the Sacred Sakura be free of the heavenly principles? Because the Sacred Sakura is a Loom of Fate separate from Irminsul, a complete loom. The stars in heaven can't influence it anymore because it's its own thing, a completely separate system. I'm also starting to suspect that Makoto needing to buy A time with the planting of the sacred sakura had nothing to do with A's grieving period, but instead is referring to an event that hasn't happened yet. Remember how we saw Dotori burning down Irminsul in Kale's dream? I'm not saying that's literally what's going to happen, but I think it hints at the goal, the destruction or at least the ultimate overhaul of Irminsul, of fate itself. Like, the end goal of the game, at least according to the Travail trailer, is to reweave the threads of fate. So perhaps Makoto is merely buying A enough time and freedom to be able to assist in making that process come to pass. Because it should be a good thing, seeing as it's the responsibility of our beloved Traveler. And speaking of which, a lot of people were really upset that the Traveler had their memory messed with, when the whole point of being a Descender is being immune to that kind of thing. But that's actually not true. Being a Descender only makes you immune to Irminsul's tampering. That doesn't mean they're immune to everything. I mean, even a simple device like the Akasha was capable of mind bending and dream warping the Traveler. But I do think it's curious that the Traveler is specifically resistant to Irminsul tampering. And I've been wondering if they're, like, integrated into the tree directly. Like, the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles restricted their powers, and it's only through touching statues of the Seven that the Traveler can regain them, and also to obtain their constellation at the very beginning of the game, because they didn't have one, which meant that they probably didn't have a fate. So it makes me wonder whether their powers are really sealed within them and they're just unlocking them by touching the statues of Seven, or if they were stolen and then placed into the Ley Lines and we're only now retrieving them. But if our powers are elemental and elemental energy can be memories, then maybe the Traveler's memories are already a part of the world. Maybe there's things they've already forgotten that they don't even realize they've forgotten. And if I may end this video with a good old-fashioned crack theory, I'm actually wondering if Irminsul was planted by Conria through time shenanigans, much like how A planted Makoto 500 years in the past. I wonder then if Dane is somewhat aware of this phenomenon, because he's called the Bough Keeper and all that, the keeper of branches, like Irminsul tree branches. Cause is it really a coincidence that A and Makoto are twins and one becomes their nation's loom while the other lives on in mourning and makes terrible decisions? Because technically the Abyss twin could be A in this scenario, and the Traveler could be Makoto, destined to become a seed that their twin plants thousands of years in the past in order to save the world in the future. And that's why the Traveler is alone at the end of the Travail trailer when Dainsleif says the threads of fate will be yours to reweave. Cause remember, a Loom of Fate can only weave its own ley lines. So if we're re-weaving, then that implies we are changing the ley lines that are already there, which means we have to be manipulating Irminsul, and not a new loom. Unless we are actually completely destroying Irminsul and then becoming our own brand new loom and then reweaving fate to replace the old fate. And it's called reweaving because we're just recreating the same system but better. But I don't know, I'm a little skeptical about that because it's not like Irminsul itself can't be manipulated. After all, both Nahida and Wanderer managed to at least achieve minor alterations to it. So if you had a greater level of authority, one could potentially change the entire world, right? That should be the Traveler in this case. Actually, now that I think about it, does Shoki no Kami count as a loom? It's got the Gnosis as the core, Wanderer as the tether, and 168 divine knowledge capsules full of memories. It does fit the criteria. Oh, also, if the Loom of Fate requires a core, then I wonder if Irminsul's core is actually the Genesis Pearl, because losing the Genesis Pearl would totally explain how Celestia's Fate machine lost its functions when Teyvat got invaded during the fall of the unified civilization. It's definitely not a new idea. I've certainly pitched it a few different ways, like I did in this video, which you should totally go watch right now because it's related and I totally haven't mentioned it multiple times throughout this video already. So go on then, click the video. Oh, but before you go, thank you all so much for supporting the channel and watching my nonsense, and please take care of yourselves. See you next time.